All right, it's good to be with you. I want to thank Andrew for the kind invitation to be with you for this series of discussions. I was privileged to be part of this a number of years ago, and to be asked back is certainly an honor, and thank you again. The commercial, the packages of books that are on the table that are wrapped in cellophane, those are free. Please take one. And they're gratis. They're books written by my father, who was a preacher for over 60 years, passed away back in 2015. And I have 2 or 3 other books that I want to promote. One is the Digging Deeper into the Word. These are available $15 each. I realize that may sound a little expensive, but there are like 40 full color photographs in this, and so when you do color photographs, it tends to up the price. But the lecture that we're going to be talking about this morning has a text in here. I'm not following it exactly. I'm not going to read it or anything, but it will give you sort of the printout of the kind of thing we're talking about. But there are additional lectures that are there as a result of the Warren Christian Apologetics Center a number of years ago. 2 other books written by my father. One is Adventures from the Pentateuch. This is $15, written by my dad. He retells a lot of the stories out of the Pentateuch and interjects into that cultural, geographical, archeological, and so forth insights. But I find more value in his points and pointers at the end of each of the chapters, which lend themselves well to some Bible class discussions and so forth. Jim Bill McIntyre wrote an introduction to this, and very gracious. Of course, if you know Jim Bill, everything he said was gracious. That doesn't mean that that's trivial, but anyway. But Jim Bill was just wired that way. This is $15, and if you buy one of these, you get an angel book for free. All right? But if you buy just the angel book, it's $5. All right? But if you do 2 for $15, otherwise, it's $5 for this. All right. So much for the commercial. All right. Thank you for your kindness to listen to that. Abraham. The genre of this discussion is very different from the other 3 that are scheduled. And I want to thank Justin for the outstanding presentation that he had on Genesis chapters 1 through 11. It was just, the guy's brilliant. Freed Hardeman is blessed to have him on faculty there. And Justin and I have gotten to know each other through Clyde Woods through the years, mentor to both of us, but a great guy, and the contribution to the church from Clyde is great. It's always a blessing to be in the presence of Dr. McClarty. I knew him while he was Bruce, and then he became my boss. And so I'm not sure exactly how to refer to him, but I do consider him a good friend, and we share heritage with dogs. I won't go into the story behind that, but it's an interesting one. Abraham. When we just casually read the biblical text, one of the impressions that we have is that Abraham is sort of living out in the middle of nowhere. Now, certainly the Bible indicates that he is a shepherd. You have this discussion when he comes back from the land of Egypt, that the herdsmen of him and Lot are not getting along because they're taxing and overworking the resources of the land, and so they have to split up. Clearly, there is a shepherd kind of thing that is going on there. Now, for most of us, if we read a little more carefully, and I hope that's true of all of us in this audience in particular, we realize that there are some towns that are scattered around. There are the 5 cities of the plain that are referred to. There's the city of Jerusalem, known as Salem. There is Abimelech that we have reference to. But to a large extent, that's about the extent of our discussion. There is a geographic reference to going to Laish, also known as Dan, as Abraham is on his way to rescue Lot. I have to admit, I preached for 25 years full-time before going into teaching, before beginning teaching at Harding. So I know local church work fairly well. I'm not going to claim to be the greatest minister under the sun, but nonetheless, I'm familiar with all of that. But I have to admit that it wasn't until I got to graduate school in archaeology that I became aware of the extreme complexity of the context within which Abraham lived. And to me, it was eye-opening. Now, that said, I want hastily to point out, I'm not arguing at all that the Bible is wrong, okay? The Bible has an agenda that, and I don't mean that in a pejorative kind of way, it has a point that it's trying to make, and like any historical account, it cannot and will not accommodate simply everything that happens to exist. But it focuses on a direction and in order to make a point. But the more we know about context, the more we know about the framework within which things take place, the deeper appreciation of a richer understanding and insight, I think, can come to light. Now, you and I, as we're reading the text, are looking at it from thousands of years removed from its composition. We're also thousands of miles removed from its cultural world. And so we look at this sort of in a static kind of frame of reference, whereas the people in the ancient world, even though they may have been hundreds of years removed from it, the culture had not changed overly much, where they would have difficulty sort of plugging into some of the dynamic and drama of what's going on. So what I want to do in this presentation this morning is to pose the question, Abraham, what did you see when you went into the land of Canaan? Because I think as we look at this, we can get a much richer appreciation of, as Justin pointed out, the faith of Abraham. Now, we'll come back to an element of that as we unfold the narrative. So, Abraham is called from Ur of the Chaldees, and here we have the ziggurat of Ur in its sort of ruined state. Here is a restored state, and this is sort of an old photograph. This is an old Buick that you see from like 1956, I think, to give you some sense of scale. Those massive tank vehicles were, from the mid-50s. Some of you younger folks won't really appreciate that. But this gives an idea of the size of this. Now, how much Abram would have been aware of the ziggurat of Ur, I don't know. Okay, but he probably would be aware of it because it was a rather imposing structure and was part of the social dynamic and drama of the community. Now, the next slide has the ziggurat of Ur by Paul Zimmerman. I was not able to put this on my computer, and so I was expecting to use my computer here rather than the one back there, and I was going to show you a nifty 3D and rotate it all over the place. But, okay, there's the data, so you can look it up for yourself. Anyway, but a fascinating reconstruction of photogrammetry that was used to reconstruct the ziggurat. Abram, of course, is going to be living in a context of some laws. Now, this is the top part of the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi stands about 7.5, 8 feet tall. It's really not very big from the standpoint of its size. It would be about this wide or so. And most people, when they see it or see the reproductions of it, University of Chicago has one of these in their museum, which is fascinating. The original is in the Louvre. I won't go into all the discussion of the discovery of it and so forth, but the top of it is sort of so far up there that most people really can't see it. And it's fairly small, when you're looking up 7.5 feet and so forth, and it's black and all that kind of stuff. But this is a photograph of the very top of this. And in this portrayal, you have Shamash, who is the sun god. In Hebrew, the Hebrew counterpart of that would be Shemesh, hence Bet Shemesh. I have a lot of affinities to that one. But Shamash is the sun god, and Hammurabi is standing in front of him. Now, as you look at the shoulders of Shamash, you see these little radiating things coming up off of his shoulders. That's the radiance of the light portrayed, sort of like sun rays. And Shamash is the god of justice, is the god of law in the ancient Mesopotamian world. Not surprising, the idea of light bringing to awareness the wickedness that goes on. And of course, the Gospel of John will talk about the light of Jesus and the light of the gospel and so forth and so on. This is not a new concept. It's one that has permeated humanity for essentially all time. Light is something that brings to light what people are doing, as opposed to the darkness within which people are operating in their sinful ways. So Abram is aware of law. Now, how much the people are following the law is sort of characteristic of the problem of humanity. We'll have a lot of laws on the books, but how well do we follow them? Just because the laws are there doesn't necessarily say anything about what people are doing. But God is going to call Abram, and he's going to go to Haran, which is up in the northern part here. So they're going to leave Ur of the Chaldees, and I do believe Ur is down here rather than up there. All right, that's another issue somebody might want to ask about that. Don't. Then there is Haran at the northern apex of the Fertile Crescent. Abram stays there for a while, several years, until finally the Lord comes to him individually. Leave your family and your kindred and go to the place that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I mean, this is the great promise. He that blesses you I will bless, he that curses you I will curse. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Abram is 75 years old when this takes place. I'm not 75 yet. And to think in terms of being 75 and moving to a brand new location is sort of scary. Now, I don't know necessarily how Abram at 75 would have felt about this, but there's no indication that God has told him where this is going to be. But Abram, in his faith, packs up the family and goes to the place that God is going to show him. And he goes down, and the first narration of where he stops is at Shechem. He doesn't live there, but he stops there and offers a sacrifice. Then he goes from there to between Bethel and Ai, where he's going to set up his tent. That's the first residence description that we have of Abram in the land of Canaan. But what was that part of the world like? Most of you, or many of you, have been to Israel and Palestine. I don't use those terms in a political sense of the term, but many of you have traveled there, and one of the things that people often ask me when they have been to Israel is it always so dry and barren? Well, it depends on what time of year you're there. Most of the time when I'm there, it's dry and barren because the excavation seasons are always in the summertime. But I have been there in other times of the year, and here is a nice view. You notice the little green hue. Sorry, it doesn't show up real well on the brown background, but the nice little green hue. This is early spring. The grass is just beginning to sprout. The sheep are all out there. And as I look at this picture, this, by the way, is not too far from Beersheba, which is one of the areas where Abram is going generally to hang out. And it's easy to imagine, okay, this could be Abram's sheep that are there, wandering around, perhaps him and Lot together for a while. Another view is that you think in terms of, in Genesis, Abram is outside his tent in the heat of the day, and he sees these three beings coming toward him. Now, in the heat of the day, I don't know what time of year that was, but in the heat of the day, normally it describes, as you're looking off on the horizon, this sort of wiggly kind of, the atmosphere distorting the picture. And I envision Abram sort of in a sense like this, sitting under a tent, in a tent or in front of a tent underneath a tree to allow the tree to serve as sort of an additional shade to cool the house, if you will. And as he's looking out, here are these three beings. It would be a scene similar to this. Again, this is not too far from Beersheba. And then you have living in tents. Now, the first time I went to Israel was about 1975, 76. I don't remember which year exactly. And we went first to Jordan. And so we were traveling around Jordan and so forth. And I remember seeing all these Bedouin tents thinking, oh, these poor people living out here in these tents and so forth. And then I got to looking at it a little more carefully, and most all of those tents had 3 or 4 Mercedes-Benzes parked outside. And so I inferred, okay, I need to reassess these poor people living in tents. Now, I don't think these are the luscious ones, but a lot of these people in that part of the world prefer to live in the tents. Matter of fact, the Bedouin prefer this. The Israelis are trying to force the Bedouin into settlements so they can sort of keep track on them and monitor their movements and all that kind of stuff. But the Bedouin prefer to have freewheeling, let me go where I want to go kind of thing. But it would be something similar to this that Abram would be living in. This again is down near Beersheba. However, the Bible does describe in Genesis chapter 14 when the kings from Mesopotamia come to the cities of the plain, and they're going to capture Lot and others and take them away. Message gets to Abram, living at Hebron at the time, and Abram is going to gather a group of folks and he's going to pursue them. And the Bible talks about he goes to Dan and then he goes to near Damascus. Dan is known in the book of Genesis primarily as Laish, okay, but it's also known as Dan, but that Dan name does not come into play until the book of Judges. And so, but as you go to visit the site of Dan, a fascinating site to visit, this is a Middle Bronze Age gate that was buried. We're not totally sure why it was buried, but the archaeologist Avraham Baran discovers this, and they excavate it, and the mud brick structures that are there, I'm standing there on the steps leading up to this, and you can see the archway that is there that is filled in with all kinds of debris and soil and everything else. And that, of course, would have been open. By the way, footnote here, you often heard perhaps when you were in elementary school that the Romans invented the arch. That's wrong. I don't know who invented the arch. They may have perfected the arch, but they didn't invent it. We have a number of examples of arches from the Middle Bronze Age. And so whoever invented it is another issue. But this is a mud brick fortification, city gate. Now, here's a photograph. Wait, wrong there. There's a photograph of a model of how they think basically it would have looked. Now, I want you to notice the ramp that is on the side of the gate, this slope that comes up. Probably at the top of that, and they show, is there a laser pointer on this thing? Yeah. At the top of this, you see a remnant of what probably was a superstructure of a wall extending above that. So what you would have is a freestanding wall with this debris, the soil that is sort of holding it in place, which allows then the wall to stand higher. So it gives it stability. Okay, so that's the issue. But the structure that we have here is known as a glacis. And what we're going to find as we go through the land of Canaan, these kinds of military installations are scattered all over the country. Here's an example of a Middle Bronze Age gate from Ashkelon. Notice the top of the arch is missing. When I talk about the Romans perfecting the arch, it may be they needed to perfect it because most of these don't have the top showing real well. But anyway, but as you look at this structure, one of the issues is the glacis that is on the outside, but this is as you go through that gate, it is long. The distance through the gate is about from where I'm standing to the wall over there. So that's what distance you have to go through the glacis to go from the outside of the city to the inside of the city. And again, you have the stone wall at the top, the glacis on the side. Of course, another advantage of the glacis it would eliminate or at least reduce the ability of the enemy to tunnel under it, because they're going to have to tunnel so far in order to get to the inside. So all kinds of advantages of this glacis structure. Now, originally, the glacis here would have been covered with a layer of plaster. Now it's sort of stepped and so forth. And it looks like it'd be sort of relatively easy to get over, but the height of that is formidable. You imagine defenders up on top of the wall. If you're trying to clamber up the slope here, you're going to be a victim pretty easily of arrows and sling stones and, boiling oil or water or whatever. By the way, they're by the coast, so it wouldn't be too hard to get the water. And so defending this, I'm not going to say it is impregnable, but nonetheless, the attacking army would have pause before they advance into this. This is a view of the site of Hatzor, an aerial view out of Google. And the Iron Age town of Hatzor, that is from the time of Solomon, is this little section right down here. The Middle Bronze Age site is about 200 acres, which, by the way, to put some perspective on this, the towns in ancient Canaan were not large. 200 acres is about the largest of the towns in the land of Canaan that we have. All right, so 200 acres isn't really that big. Now, that doesn't preclude people living outside of the city and so forth and so on, and perhaps retreating into the town under times of siege. But nonetheless, the fortification system itself was really quite small, relatively speaking. So when we talk about towns, we should not think in terms of even Columbia as being comparable. I mean, Columbia here is huge relative to what, I don't know about the cracking voice there, but is huge relative to all of the sites that we have in the land of Canaan. But nonetheless, they're formidable. Now, the fortification system here is really rather interesting. Well, let me come back here. On the west side, there is a moat. Normally, when we think in terms of moat, we think of medieval castles and so forth with water and, all kinds of critters running around in it. But they're dry moats, and this is the dry moat that the people at Hatzor built. They dug out about 30 feet below the surface down to a certain level. They took that soil and piled it up over here so that the enemy, should they attack, are going to have to come in, go down a 30-foot slope, up about a 30-degree angle, and climb up another 60 feet before they come into the interior of the town. Now, again, on a certain level, when you first look at this, that wouldn't be a big deal. But when you've got folks shooting arrows at you and slinging stones at you, again, it's going to give you pause, against, I think I'll just go attack a town. It's not something you just casually do. From the site of Gezer, which is in the Shephelah, you have a portion of a fortified tower that is here. This is me. I'm not necessarily the greatest of scale, but at least you can look at how tall I am. But you can see how significantly large that tower was. This is what's left of it. And to the right of it then is the city gate that allows access. These little indentations that you see along the way may have some structural element, but another element is the defenders could stand behind those and shoot arrows and so forth at the attackers coming in and sort of clog the gate up so that it would be more difficult for anybody to intrude. I mean, all of this is ingenious kind of stuff that goes on. Gezer also has its glacis. And here you can see faintly the slope that goes at an angle here. That's the surface of the glacis. The stuff on top of it is the debris over millennia that has accumulated on this, but the structure compacted underneath that is part of that glacis. And again, climbing up this at the angle here is much more steep than 30 degrees. It's more like 40 degrees, maybe 45. And the defenders, if they get this moist at all with a water and oil mixture, it would make it extremely slick and very difficult to climb up. And again, sort of the defense factor that takes place. This is part of the Middle Bronze Age fortification system at Jericho. And if you go around the corner on the west side, you'll see the remnants of the glacis associated with this from Middle Bronze Age Jericho. Most of the tourists never get to see this because it's cordoned off. When I was there, the cordon was down. So I took advantage of the lack of barrier. I do respect the barriers, okay, so. But this is the remnant of the glacis that is there. Now, at the site of Bet Shemesh, where I'm field director, and we've re-excavated the Middle Bronze Age gate that was originally uncovered back in the early 1900s. And this is an aerial view of the gate, and it would be about the size of from where I am to the wall and the corner. So it's pretty good size. You can see over here on the left-hand side the thickness of the wall. This is not an extremely strong structure, but nonetheless, it still implies the need for some sort of a defensive character. And Bet Shemesh, the house of the sun here, is in the Shephelah, not too far from Gezer. And so you have this, again, fortification system dotted around the country. There's the entrance going into it. You see the little indentations that you have, again, behind which defenders could stand. Now, we'd move to the side of Shechem. And this is the Middle Bronze Age wall that remains at Shechem. It stands taller than the ceiling here if you were to stand at the foot of it. But one of the things that's particularly interesting here is there's the wall that we're looking at here on the side. But I want you to notice this fortress temple. We refer to it as a Migdal temple. The word Migdal basically means fortress. The ancient Israelites were great at naming things sort of what they are. If they had a dog, they name it dog. If they have a cat, they name it cat. If it's a fortress temple, they name it a fortress. Okay, so this is sort of the way the function works. But as you look at this, you can recognize the walls here are pretty thick. Okay, now to put this in perspective, if you'll notice, and this is dating from the 50s and 60s, here is sort of your typical, almost a Buick type size vehicle, and notice its comparison to the thickness of the walls. I'd say that begins to approach fortress quality. By the way, this is on top of additional temples below it. This is one that Larry Stager at Harvard argues was burned down by Abimelech in the book of Judges. But you have this superimposition of fortress-type temples, one on top of the other. At Megiddo, you have the same phenomenon. None of these are in existence anymore because this is out of that big trench that was dug through and dug through and dug through, and all of these are gone. But these would have been superimposed one on top of the other. But again, you're looking at walls that are 8, 9, 10, 12 feet thick. You know, you're not talking about just, an 18-inch thick wall. You're talking about something that's formidable, into which people could retreat, probably the elite folks. But it was also a repository of wealth, where people would bring their, where the temple people would have their gold and silver and valuables and so forth, and sort of the bank of the ancient world. And this was an ongoing kind of thing. The Temple of Diana at Ephesus is another wonderful example of this kind of thing. But these are all Middle Bronze Age temples from the side of Megiddo. Now, we shift gears in another direction here. This is the high place, often referred to as the high place at Gezer. And the series of stones that you have here are thought by the archaeologists and anthropologists to be representations of sort of an occasional kind of gathering of city-states in the vicinity where they would come together and sort of reaffirm their allegiance to one another, that if one of them is attacked, then they'll band together to defend each other. Sort of a NATO kind of thing, all right? Now, why this is necessarily there are different sizes of the stela, I don't know necessarily the answer to that. Perhaps it has to do with the size of the site or whatever, but there are 10 of these that are here. And now you have to understand these city-states are really not much larger than typical counties in Tennessee and Arkansas. That would be sort of your city-state kind of thing, which also plays into the narration in Joshua when it talks about the king of Akshaph won, the king of Megiddo won, the king of, so forth and so on. All of them won. And you look at all of these, and they're just little towns, sort of like medieval Europe kind of thing. But this implies an element of the need for defense. Now, I've tried to lay some groundwork here to elaborate further. We're looking at a cover of the story of Sennacherib and two examples of the story of Sennacherib. And perhaps most of you are not familiar with the story of Sennacherib, but it's about an Egyptian fellow in the 1900s BC who, while he's on a military campaign, the king dies and a new king comes to the throne, and for whatever reason, I'm not going to go into the details here, Sennacherib is fearful for his life and he runs away to the land of Canaan. And while he's at the land of Canaan, he is hired by a local chief. I'm going to call him Bedouin, but that's not the appropriate term here. But he's hired by a local chief to train his household in military arts, because this guy has been a general in the Egyptian army. Now, one of the fascinating things about the story of Sennacherib is its description of the land of Canaan. It'll talk about a land flowing with milk and honey and figs and dates, and it dovetails perfectly with what the biblical text describes as the land of Canaan. And Sennacherib remains there and becomes sort of the military trainer and advisor for this local chieftain. So you have this militarism that is taking place. Now we're going to sort of flesh elements of this out. Now, back in the land of Egypt, there's a tomb at a place called Beni Hassan, and sadly I've never been there. All right, it's one of those places that's difficult to get to. It's sort of dangerous to go to, and so forth. But please, one day, I hope to get there. But this is a painting of a painting off the wall. Now, the way this works, The donkey nose back here should be over here. It's a big, long, skinny painting. And this is sort of a plaster and fresco kind of painting that is there. Now, this has been sort of cleaned up and crisped and everything else in the painting reproduction. But what you have is the two Egyptians in the front who are leading this series of individuals from the land of Canaan. And there are 37 of them in the company, and that's the tally that is up there. And the name is Abshu or something like that. I forget exactly the name. And they're talking about them coming from the land of Canaan into the land of Egypt. Now, one of the things that's interesting as you look at this, one of the colorful garments that the Canaanites have. Now, this sort of makes for an interesting coat of many color kind of thing. Okay, but that's another whole issue. I'll let Nathan, I think, is going to be dealing with that. Maybe. Anyway, but look at the weapons that are there. You have over here, there are bows that we have. I keep wanting to push the wrong one. There's a bow, there's throwing sticks, there's spears. Little boy with a spear, little spear on there. That's a liar, by the way. He has a quiver on his back. He has a bow. He has that's not a throwing stick. That's actually an axe, a duck-bill axe, a weapon. We'll come back to that. But they're all pretty well armed. Now, on a certain level, most of us would think, well, if you're traveling out in the middle of the Sinai along the coast coming into the land of Egypt, you might be exposed to marauders and attacks and so forth, and so you would have these weapons available. Yes, okay, I won't deny that. But it's interesting the Egyptians look at them this way. All right, they're thinking in terms of, look at the weaponry. Now, these individuals, by the way, are coming peacefully. They're dealing in coal. K-O-H-L has nothing to do with a department store. All right, K-O-H-L is the black junk that the Egyptians would use as the eyeliner, which sort of retards the flies from around the eyes, also reduces the glare. So there's practical advantages of this, but there are also copper workers that are coming down, and the little weird thingies that you see on the back of the donkey here and the back of the donkey there, these are bellows for the oxygenation to increase the temperature and so forth and so on. So these are itinerant individuals. Now, this is roughly contemporary with Abram going down to the land of Egypt. This is about 1900 BC. Okay, and I realize the date of Abraham is open to some question, but I'm inclined to put Abraham, certainly the rest of the patriarchs, into the Middle Bronze Age. But I'm inclined to put Abraham at least at the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. And so it's easy to imagine them looking something like this. I'm making no claim that this is Abraham. Okay, do not make that equation. But it's easy to imagine them looking something like this, going down into the land of Egypt, and there obviously is a fairly open border, if you will. The Egyptians are going to eventually become concerned about that, and they build a wall? Anyway, I'm going to leave that alone. They do. They actually do build a wall. But anyway, politics haven't changed much, have they? And but this would be very similar to what Abram would have been doing going down into the land of Egypt to escape the famine. Now, shifting gears a bit here. I meant to bring these up from the table back there. The international trade that is under consideration and the diplomacy. There is trade in tin from Mari to Hatzor, and then there are also diplomats that go from Babylon to Hatzor. Now, in case you're not really big on that, that's Mari to Hatzor. And then the diplomats from Babylon would be over that. Now, the distance from Babylon to Mari is about 250 miles. The distance from Mari to Hatzor is about 300 miles. For a maximum travel of about 20 miles a day, which nobody's going to do in succession. But if one were traveling about 20 miles a day, which would be overtaxing it for a very long journey, it would take at least 72 days to make the trip from Babylon to Hatzor. But they know about each other. And you have these diplomats that are going there. And then you have the trade in tin from Mari to Hatzor, which would be 300 miles. And the quantity of tin that is shipped is recorded. 77 pounds of tin is shipped from Mari to Hatzor, and 10 pounds of tin is shipped to Laish, Dan. Okay? Now you may wonder, what's the significance of the tin? Well, it plays into weapons development. And it's interesting throughout history how military arts have been often technological jumps that take place. You think in terms of the space industry in the United States, or even the war industry back in, especially before World War II and developing in World War II. All right, if you're familiar with military arts and history and so forth. Now, I talked about the duck-billed axe. That is a duck-billed axe. Those two are duck-billed. You can see why they might be called duck-billed. They're not very big. They're about this long. By the way, there's one of these in the museum at Harding. It was too much trouble to get it out of the cabinet to bring. Okay, so I left it there. But if you're ever at Harding, there's a good chance it'll be on the display. If it's not, it's in my office. Okay, it's mine. It's not Harding's. Okay. And these are not used for chopping down trees. These are used for clacking people. And when you look at the image, that last dude in the sequence, he's carrying one of these. And this gives us sort of a chronology of the duck-billed axe. The large one that you see on the left-hand side is from the late early Bronze period. But once the Middle Bronze Age comes, the technology of tin production into bronze has taken hold. And bronze is a much more valuable commodity for its durability, holding an edge. It'll break easier. Pure copper bends fairly easily, but bronze can hold an edge and serve as a more suitable weapon. All right? Now, this is a mold from Shechem where they would pour the metal into the mold and then dump it out and make these axes. What we have on the bottom here is a chisel axe. I have an example of one of these, a real example, by the way, over on the table. Feel free to have a look at it. Don't touch, all right? And it's about this long. And the width of it, the height of it is about maybe an inch, 3/4 to an inch high. Again, it's not for chopping down trees. It's for cracking skulls, breaking bones. It's a weapon. It's sort of like a tomahawk or a hatchet kind of thing. Okay, it's a weapon. Now, when we think in terms of the tin production, this is a portrayal from the land of Egypt, which you could readily tell. This is a copper ingot that sort of is the standard shipping mode. They would pour the ingots of the copper into these shapes, and then they would ship these off in boats and so forth to different locations. This is taken from the ocean, and they hang vertically. Okay, so the little tabs at the top will serve as the hangers as they line them up in the ships and everything else. But it's interesting, if you look carefully down here, this dude down here is carrying one of these on his shoulders. These typically are like 65 pounds apiece, raw copper. And so this would be a talent. When the Bible, Old Testament, talks about a talent, this is a talent of copper. Okay, they're big, they're heavy, and they're typically would be raw materials like this. Now, if we think in terms of the weapon productions, typical bronze in the ancient world would be, and even modern time, is about 5% tin to copper. Okay, so if you have copper on the top, tin ingots that have been found, by the way, in excavations on the bottom. If alloy is 5% tin, then 10 pounds of tin at Laish would yield 200 pounds of bronze. And when you think in terms of 77 pounds of tin at Katsor, it would yield 1,540 pounds of bronze. Now, I realize bronze can be used for other things. Okay. Again, if you look at the display over here, I have a little bronze god in a little plastic thing. Please do not touch. All right. But a little bronze god inside a little plastic thing. And so the bronze would often be used for other things, but a lot of the metals were used to make weapons. So if we think in terms of the chisel axe, which, by the way, takes less metal than the duckbill didn't really last very long. Very complex to make. The chisel axe is fairly easy to make because you have a mold. But 200 pounds of bronze at Laish would yield about 400 chisel axes and about 1,600 arrowheads, or about 1,600 arrowheads. Again, I have a broken bronze arrowhead over there on the display. pretty sizable arsenal. So you think in terms of that Chatzor, it would yield over 3,000 of these chisel axes and over 12,000 arrowheads. This is the world in which Abraham comes. This is a map showing some of the fortified Middle Bronze Age sites. Not all of them. To put it in perspective, the distance from Dan up here to Beersheba right there, as a crow flies, is only 150 miles. How far is it from here to Memphis? Somebody. Not 300 to Memphis. 180, 200. Okay, so it's shorter than the distance from here to Memphis. And so as Abram is wandering around with his sheep and goats, he cannot help but occasionally see these things. And certainly gets sucked into the militarism when he is called on to go rescue his nephew Lot. Now, the Egyptians were concerned about this militarism. And that concern is demonstrated in the form of execration texts. They're curse texts. The one in the middle is from the museum in Brussels. The one on the left-hand side is from the Eretz Israel Museum in Israel. And some of these forms would be the form of a doll, and they would write the king's names and the town name. You know, the king of Akshaf, and the king of Megiddo, and the king of Ta'anak, and the king of Shechem, and the king of Gezer, and so forth. And a lot of the names are names that we know out of the Bible, as far as the towns are concerned. And so they would have these curses on there, and then they would break the doll as sort of the enaction of the curse. Now, in the academic world, I get frustrated sometimes with my academic world. Everybody argues about everything, all right? And so the argument is, whoa, the Egyptians weren't really concerned about all of this. Well, wait a minute. It does look like they were concerned. It may have been more in their mind than reality, but the reality of all of this fortification system is, yeah, there's potentially a threat here. What happens if all these Canaanites get together and they decide to invade Egypt? After all, that is sort of going to happen, although I don't think Hyksos invasion was an invasion in the military sense of the term, but anyway, that's another ballgame. But they're concerned about this militarism because they know people on the ground. Sinohe has been that. Sinohe knows the kind of militarism that is there. And we have all of this other documentation that takes place that shows the militarism of the region. So when Abram gathers together 318 men trained in his household in military arts, why does he have this? The Bible doesn't elaborate on this, except for this revelation. By the way, footnote here, this is apparently not unique. Because when Jacob comes back to the land of Canaan from Haran, his messengers find out that Esau's on his way with 400 military folks. And Jacob gets paranoid. Be interesting to pursue that one following your discussion. Now, this, by the way, is a photograph from Lawrence of Arabia, which, by the way, if you've never seen Lawrence of Arabia, you really must watch. But be sure you take 3 or 4 potty breaks through it. It's a long movie. But it's easy to imagine Abram's entourage, along with, by the way, his comrades from Hebron, Kiryat Arba, who are with him, to go retrieve Lot at Dan, and then ultimately at Damascus. This is a typical Middle Bronze Age tomb of a rich person. This is from Jericho. This is on display in the Rockefeller Museum, which sadly a lot of people don't go to anymore. And it's a marvelous display. And I don't want to argue that this is how Abram was buried, but there is legitimate reason to say this likely is very similar to how Abram was buried, okay? Because he's going to buy this cave, and he's going to bury his wife in it. Eventually, he's going to be buried in it. And then Isaac and Rebekah are going to be buried in it. And then Leah is going to be buried in it. Rachel, by the way, is buried elsewhere. And then Jacob asks, you take me back and bury me in that cave. Now, how many other people there might have been in that cave, we don't know. But these are designed to be sort of multi-generational, multi-use, multi-function. And on the platform in the middle is the deceased. Now, question is this the head of household kind of situation, or is this just the latest occupant put in? But if you look carefully, you can see around the perimeter skulls of other individuals that had been sort of shoveled over to the side with their bones and so forth. And this individual lying in the middle, they are grave goods, dipper juglets, which, by the way, there's some of those back there, dipper juglets and so forth, furniture pieces and all that. This is the kind of situation that Abram buys. This is, other than the digging of the wells, this is the only property he ever owns in the land of Canaan. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Once I became aware of all of this, and by the way, this is not all of it, okay, but once I became aware of all of this, one of the questions that I wondered, did Abraham ever look at all of this and wonder, how is God going to do this? When is God going to do this? Perhaps more readily would be the when question. But how? And as far as the Bible is concerned, the only occasion his military arts come into the situation is when he rescues Lot. And even then, he refuses to take any bounty. Remember? When Melchizedek says, I want to reward you, Abram says, no. Just reimburse the folks for what they've consumed. I don't want you to think that you have contributed to my success at all. As we look at the militarism of the land of Canaan during the Middle Bronze Age, I am more impressed with his faith. I was impressed with it before, but I'm more impressed with it now. And I'm hoping that you can appreciate the same. Thank you.